It is so wonderful to see so many of our friends here tonight. I am excited to introduce Christopher Sebastian. He is the Director of Social Media for Peace Advocacy Network. He sits on the Advisory Council for Encompass Movement. He's a Senior Fellow at Sentient Media. He is co-founder of VGN, and he lectures at Columbia University in the Department of Social Work for the graduate course POP, Power, Oppression, and Privilege. Using a multidisciplinary approach that includes media theory, political science, and social psychology, he focuses on how human relationships with other animals shapes our attitudes about race, sexuality, and class. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for joining us from Prague at 2 in the morning. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really happy to see so many people here. Some people that I've talked to before at other events, so it's really great.
It is wonderful, and I want to go on the record saying that I thought you were in New York when I asked you to join us at 5 p.m. Pacific time. So thank you for joining us now at 2 in the morning. All right.
Absolutely. It's a small time difference, small, very.
Yes, okay. All right. So the very first thing that I want to ask you is just about the journey that brought you here today. I believe that the work that you are doing is so needed in this movement. So I wanted to ask, what motivates you? Why are you doing this work?
I'm motivated by just injustice, really. I am really excited, or I'm really animated by the ways that animal agriculture and our relationships with other animals impacts our relationships with one another as humans. And so, when I started this journey, which was not on purpose, probably 7 years ago now, longer. It's 2021. I forget that. It was just it was not with the understanding about animal agriculture and its impact on our daily lives that I have now. And I've met a lot of really, really incredible people along the way who have influenced me and who have taught me so much and really put me in a position to be able to share what I know with other people so much more effectively.
Great. And so when did you start teaching at Columbia? Because I'm very interested in what the reception was like around the POP course and how people have been able to receive the information around the interconnectedness of race, class, and species.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I started teaching Columbia in, I believe, 2015, 2016. I was invited to be a guest lecturer by Professor Zarandrian Morris, who is herself a trans Black woman. And she had invited me to speak as part of her class, as just a one-time guest lecture, because she is herself not vegan, didn't really have a relationship with speciesism, and the course that she teaches, which is again for the Department of Social Work, is all about pushing past our comfort zones, pushing past where we're comfortable. And so you have this group of students who are really familiar with with feminism, with theories like intersectionality, with critical race theory, with all of these things that that they pretty well had in hand. But who really didn't have an understanding of, or even a knowledge of speciesism or what it was. And so, pushing past her own comfort zone, she wanted to invite me in to speak to her students. And yeah, as future social workers, it was a unique challenge for them, because you feel like you already have you understand class, you understand sexuality, you understand gender and all of these things because you've been studying it for so long. And then you're confronted with something that that really does make you feel uncomfortable. And it should make you feel uncomfortable because our relationships with other animals is so broken. And for me, having a background in journalism, having a background as a technical writer, I felt like the most effective way to introduce people to really tough topics in a way that would be less confronting for them, was to focus on on pop culture, and really teach people. And this is something that is not new, by the way. Bell Hooks had been doing it for a really long time. She's been talking about it in previous books. And so everything that I do is rooted in Black feminism, and just radical Black women who like, you know, who have these amazing ideas. And so like that was a way, like that was a window for people to look into this, like and not feel as threatened as we otherwise would and have a really good time. And so yeah, like students like always start very apprehensively, but in 6 years, I've never had a student like walk away and said that like I hated everything that you just said. Like that was really bad. Like and yeah, like this has become like a regular course now. And so like it's been an amazing journey. And I really love it. So like we've built like a fantastic thing together. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really humbled by the way that people receive it, and the relationships that I've built with people over these past 6 years.
That's interesting, and kind of reminds me of one of my colleagues' stories of also through FFAC giving a guest lecture in a class and then being asked to be a lecturer at the university. So maybe this is going to happen more and more often. What you were saying about the window is really resonating with me, because on the last call we had with Matthew Hayek, we were talking about environmental movements and how to bring in issues of, food into the conversation around the environment and animals. And what he said very clearly is that it can't come as like something completely separate, but you have to show that like you actually do care about these environmental issues. And I think that most people, I think every person on this call actually does, but a lot of people were not raising their hands saying that, I have, sat outside of a power plant or, something that is polluting, and there wasn't always that solidarity there. So I'm wondering about the approach that you've been taking, especially because I know that you do speak to a lot of social justice groups, and speciesism is oftentimes a new topic or one that's not as often talked about.
Yeah, that's really tough. Like I try to explain to people, like, you know, when you talk about the psychology of racism, for example, like we're really good about like constructing these in groups and out groups. And like we build up these very strict boundaries around like, you know, who is included in our in group. And and yeah, like this always comes up because like you know, the harder those boundaries are that we draw, the more violently we have to police them. And like, you know, and so with that understanding, like, you know, this is what we've done with other animals to the degree that we don't even recognize ourselves as animals. We have like, you know, we've created this like this very bizarre type of exceptionalism around what it means to be human, and like, you know, and separate from everyone else who exists in the animal kingdom. And you frequently hear people use the phrase animals are here with us, not for us. And that really resonates with me, because like, you know, we've turned them into these like objects, rather than recognizing them as like, you know, as other persons who exist on this planet with us. And like as a Black person, like this particularly resonates with me because of the shared history that we have around these issues. And that I think also like helps people to make this connection in the broader sense, because you know you're talking to a person who has personally experienced like, you know, the consequences of these boundaries that we've drawn. And like for other animals, it happens to be constructed around species. For myself, it's constructed around race and constructed around like gender presentation and sexual orientation. And so like, you know, and so yeah, like, you know what, recognizing that commonality and like and honoring that solidarity that we have with other animals was really, really important to me. And like I hope I've been able to make it important to other people as well.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about at other conferences is just this idea that I feel as though sometimes people will think that you, Sebastian, are just introducing this idea that there are all these connections. And I've heard you say this, it's not me. Like this has been a part of our history. What does it even mean to be human? There was a time when human actually really only meant a certain, white, wealthy man, and you were just drawing those connections. Have you found that you're still like having to say that over and over again?
Yes, all the time. That's the thing. And that's what I think resonates with most people. Is that like when we have these conversations, like I think that people are willing to learn as long as you introduce the topic in a way that that situates it within the things that are already of interest to them, that places it firmly within their wheelhouse. And so, like, when I talk about these historical connections, when I talk about, like, and they're not even connections so much as I think Patrice Jones talks about it in terms of like commonalities that we share, like, that makes it real for people. That creates an urgency for people that otherwise wouldn't exist. We're in this together. Like, what, we have created this binary between, like, Black liberation and animal liberation, or queer liberation and animal liberation, or even Black liberation and queer liberation. And it's like, we don't have to be at odds. These aren't mutually exclusive things. It happens together. Like, we are so quick to compartmentalize struggles, and we don't realize that we're all riding the struggle bus. And so it's like, yeah, like, these things have always been present. And I frequently use examples from like historical examples from texts that illustrate that it is the animalization of or the racialization of animals that, like, that animates racism in many ways, that animates, like, queer antagonism, and homophobia. And so, like, yeah, like, and this all very much relates to the politics of the societies that we live in. And it really, really relates to white supremacy. It is a frequent theme that comes up over and over again in these dialogues. And, like, and so, like, having that recognition that it's a shared struggle, and, like, and really, like, reframing the issue so that, like, so that people are challenged by it rather than feeling threatened by it, that is so important too. So
Yes, and I've heard you say, give a very similar message around how we can't be compartmentalizing, that if we have single issue veganism, it will not lead to animal liberation. And it sounds as though you're often speaking at Veg Fest, for example. We were speaking to a large number of vegans, and they are, I think, like a lot of us, very much on the same page that what's happening to animals other than human is terrible, right? There's incredible suffering there, and there's so much focus on that. And I'm wondering, if this is what it's been like in our movement for many years now, what is the danger of that compartmentalization, and how will making these connections more explicit lead to animal liberation?
yeah, that's a really great question. It's a complex question too. um it is important because for decades now, I see people who are in leadership roles in, like, the movement for, like, animal rights, or animal liberation, like, I say more specifically, um, and they do try to compartmentalize it. They do want it to be a more individualized struggle, or maybe they don't recognize that, like, that the struggle is connected, and that is to our detriment, because, like I just said, like, what people actually do, like, care about these things when you situate it in something that, like, is already familiar to them. And people also respond to, like, authenticity, and solidarity. And to that end, like, when you make people realize that, like, that we're in this together, and that you care about the issues that are important to them, they're really receptive to your issues as well. And I do unfortunately think that it is a very, like, the mainstream community is constructed around, well, unfortunately, whiteness again. And it is so common, like, in single issue veganism to center, like, middle class consumer, like, concerns, or, like, or try to make it into, like, a consumer movement, or reduce veganism to, like, a consumer boycott. And in that sense, I actually don't really like to talk about veganism, because, it already has this, like, this cloud over its head, this, like, people have this popular understanding of what it means to be vegan, and, like, oh my god, I love my kale smoothies, and I love to, like, eat, like, delicious, like, algae or wonderful thing. I can't even imagine, like, I'm sitting here eating French fries and like, and hummus, like, 8 days a week. But but yeah, like, you know what, like for myself, like I don't even find it like productive to like to walk into a conversation and or into a classroom and try to introduce people to quote veganism. Um because I think that like veganism, as I think Drew Robert Winter, he's an anthropologist, like, you know, he once said, that's the practice, or the practical application of animal liberation. And that's what I want to get people on board with, because people like think of veganism as a diet. People think of it as food choices, and that to me feels like a trap. And it's unfortunate because, like, you know, that's something that's been constructed over time, thanks in large part to single issue veganism. But like, you know, but like I ask people, like, you know what, do you care about other animals? Like, you know, do you recognize the sentience and, like, you know, and honor the personhood of these other millions of creatures with whom we share this planet? Like, you know what, does animal exploitation, or does exploitation writ large, like, you know, is that something that you want to abolish? Are the principles of, like, you know, of liberation important to you? And if so, that's our common ground, that's our starting point. And so, like, you know what, maybe you like, we don't have to have an argument about like whether or not you have access to plant-based foods at all times, like every day. Like that's that conversation is an irrelevancy, because I want to have a conversation about our shared values. And like, you know, and that is like that lays the foundation, that's the groundwork upon which we, like, you know, we can like really see each other meaningfully. And we do, like, you know, like in the practical sense, have so much overlap, we do have so much commonality. Like I can't imagine, and I've used this example several times, like, you know, I can't imagine, like, you know, a movement in which we don't recognize the struggles of like First Nations people, or like, you know, Native Americans, like, you know, are not our struggles, because like when we're protecting their rights and we're protecting their land, we're also protecting the land that free living animals live on. You know, like that's our struggle. Like these are not single issue struggles. When we like introduce the fact that, like, you know, that the cattle ranching is a major driver of climate change, and like the acquisition of land for cattle ranching, it displaces native persons as well as like free living animals, and so it's a threat to both of those communities, those vulnerable communities that need to be protected. And so yeah, like, you know what, like the commonality becomes clear. Like we don't have to be adversarial in our relationships with one another, when we're seeking liberation. That's part of the tools that, like, you know, that keeps us separated. Like oppression doesn't, like, you know, exist in a bubble, like it thrives in that isolation. And it benefits from, like, you know, from us like fighting one another instead of fighting, like, you know, against the common enemy, which is largely capitalism and white supremacy.
As you were speaking, I was just seeing a lot of staff members nodding their heads because we talk a lot about the importance of connecting with our students and how there's so many issues that are already important to them and meeting them on their shared values. So I just wanted to know that that's why you're seeing a lot of head nodding happening, because that's exactly what we're doing, right? Because there are so many stereotypes of people doing this work. I mean, what you were talking about with like the kale smoothies or whatever. And I'm not trying to put down kale smoothies. I'm sure they are very delicious. I probably had them before as well.
Wonderful.
But for that to be the narrative, I think has been very harmful for the movement, because we're not seeing diverse representation in animal advocacy. We're not necessarily seeing that represented in people who are trying to help, trying to end factory farming, which is, you know, the mission of our organization. So I remember that you gave a talk where you showed something, I believe it was from the pop course, where you had people write down the very first words that came to mind when they heard the word vegan. And one of them was just around soy, which really hit home for me because I've been talking a lot about how concerned I am about the term soy boy. That's just been really pervasive in pop culture. um, and the concerns I have around that, especially when it comes to some of the history around, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act and, you know, the feminization of Asian men. And so for me, it's just all coming full circle all the time, like the more that I delve into this. And I'm wondering if, as you've now been teaching the pop course for many years now, are those stereotypes changing? Are you seeing more representation where it's not just that typical like soy boy hipsters, whatever.
Yeah, I actually am seeing a lot more representation. That was a long time in coming. And I'm really proud of that. Like I'm really proud of the people who have like staked their claim in this movement, and like, and owned their their relationship with animal liberation, and and who strongly identify with the needs of other animals and communities that that we don't belong to. And I'm really grateful for the people who have like blazed those trails over the years, talking about like women in particular, like Carol Adams, who wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat now a quarter of a century ago. Breeze Harper, who wrote Sister Vegan, I think in 2010. So it's been a decade of that book sitting on people's shelves. And and so many largely influential people who who are being recognized as as leaders, and who who break down these barriers of like what it means to be part of this movement. And like I'm seeing comments from people that are coming in, the narrative of veganism is also restrictive. It's so true. It's so true. And and that that single very narrow narrative, or understanding of veganism that we have, that has been such a constant roadblock to people actually being part of this movement. And I'm really excited for the types of people who now are are speaking up, or whose voices are being recognized and heard and listened to, not just heard, but absolutely listened to.
Yes. Okay. I'm loving what we're seeing in the chat, because it's definitely something that our staff has been talking a lot about, involving diet culture, fat phobia, all these things. You
Oh
used
my
the word
God.
identity, and that is something that's been very interesting for us to grapple with, this idea of identity and identity politics. And last year at the Conscious Eating Conference, which was in March 2020, where I saw you in person, never knew that all of this pandemic was going to happen. But at that conference, you said that at the Conservative Political Action Conference, Ted Cruz had said, "I hope to see PETA supporting the Republican Party now that the Democrats want to kill all the cows." And you also showed a clip of Sarah Palin on New Year's, and she gave a resolution, and her very first of 3 resolutions was to eat more meat, which was fascinating because, as you noted, it's not as though there were a bunch of people around her saying, "You need to stop eating meat." She said that because she was trying to use eating meat as a signifier of solidarity. And it was very disturbing to me at the time, to when I really started to think about that. I'm wondering it's now been a year since you gave that talk. Are you still seeing this connection between eating meat and identity? And do you see any hope for any of that to change? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry about that. I didn't want the echo. I didn't want that smoke. Yeah, I actually see it more now than I did a year ago. I started writing lithography on the consumption of animal products and identity 2.5 years ago at this point. And and now, only now, in this moment am I seeing it being a conversation had in mainstream news, which is exciting. But also, I told y'all so, 2 years ago, and now people are starting to listen. But yeah, that's a very real thing. What you're describing, and what I was talking about during that conference, for people who weren't there, which is the majority of us, is that is the conversation around identity politics. We usually think that oh, it's women who are playing identity politics, and it's people of color or Black people, who are playing identity politics. But we never think of white people as playing identity politics, when they are the OG players, the of identity politics, and not just white people, very specifically white men. We are in this situation largely because white identity, and particularly white masculinity, is revered, or that is an identity. It's not the template against which all others are measured, including animals. That's an identity, and it's one of many. And for whatever reason, I could talk for hours about that. But white identity in the United States in particular has decided to use meat as representative of of their identity, or as symbolic of their identity. And and we see that playing out in incredibly destructive ways all the time. And so in that, in that presentation, I was giving examples of it, but largely, and again, this is where media theory comes in. We're talking about concepts of encoding and decoding messages. And so we have encoded meat with whiteness and what it means to be an American. And and there's this long, very proud history of of the consumption of meat, and red meat in particular, in addition to pork, as synonymous with Americana. Or with American exceptionalism, as was the case with Sarah Palin. She actually, instead of encoding it, discreetly, she made that encoding very overt, because she had 3 New Year's resolutions. The first one, as she described as eating more meat. And and so that's a dog whistle, if you will, that encoding. And then she said that she wanted to make the American government as irrelevant to our lives as possible. And then she said that she wanted to restore America to its exceptionalism. So she had actually taken this this quietly encoded message and made it very overt, made it very bare. Whereas others like Ted Cruz, had made it more discreetly. And they're not the only ones. This is in the Republican logic, this is a front in the culture wars. But it's not new. It's not a new front in the culture wars. It's been there the entire time. The use of American land for cow ranching in particular, the symbolic use of things like pork, as something that it's not just part of white identity, but Christian identity as well, because of the religious prohibitions against eating pork for Jewish people or Muslim people, who are both marginalized in the United States. These are all messages that are encoded into these very unassuming little cuts, or cut up bits of animal. And we don't recognize it, but helping people to recognize it actually helps them to understand the importance of animal liberation, and how we can't divorce ourselves in our participation in the system, the larger system of animal agriculture, without recognizing the messages that we're sending out too. And that is the messages of superiority, of hierarchy, and our own exceptionalism, or our own perceived exceptionalism. And so a part of our resistance is it's a resistance to our to ourselves, because we have to confront that part of ourselves that that isn't very attractive, and we have to recognize that we can exist in multiple spaces as victimizer and victim. And that's never fun, that's never comfortable. To see that we can have multiple competing identities. And yeah, so that's hard, but I also see that more and more people are taking this up as a tool of political resistance to the hierarchy that we've established in the United States. And that's a beautiful thing to me.
I'm just so grateful to you, Sebastian, for coming on and talking about this, because oftentimes the line of questioning with our students during whenever we do these Socratic style seminars with them, it's sometimes around what are the barriers to eating more plant-based. That's a line of questioning. And for me personally, a lot of the times the questions are around health and maybe food access. And I don't feel like we're always acknowledging how identity plays into a huge part of what we are eating. So thank you for bringing this, for me, very full circle in this whole Culture Shift conversation series. I know.